Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. Oh. Okay, maybe you... these are my daughters, who I think are going to leave. Thank you for coming. We're going to talk about regulation on social media, sort of specifically reactions to misinformation and fake news, and whether regulation is being enacted too hastily. I have here on the panel Tanit Koch, who is Managing Director for German news channel NTV, and she's also setting up an integrated central newsroom for RTL Germany. And Damian Tambini, who is an associate professor in the LSE Media and Communications Department, who I've been working with, and Alexandre Alaphilippe, who is executive director of the DisinfoLab, which is a Brussels-based NGO which researches disinformation, looks at its causes, and is developing a cross-expertise community around disinformation. And so at the LSE, we've been looking into tackling the information crisis, which has many aspects, but it seems that the spread of misinformation has spurred a lot more people into thinking about what's going on online and whether there's any need for regulation. And at the moment in the UK, we're waiting for the publication of a government white paper which will lay out plans for legislation on how to deal with online harms, which is essentially going to be how to regulate social media. And as well as misinformation and disinformation, this is going to include things like terrorist propaganda, child sexual exploitation, cyberbullying, harassment, online misogyny, promotion of suicide and self-harm. So there are a lot of different things that this is going to encompass, but it does seem that addressing misinformation has been one of the sort of motivations for bringing forward this kind of legislation. And I mean, one of the big problems that governments are facing is the lack of evidence for harm, which makes it difficult to come up with a proportionate response. And it's sort of everybody knows these things are happening, but it's hard to know the extent of the problem. And one of the laws that's come under quite a lot of criticism is a law that's been enacted in Germany at the start of last year, which requires platforms to take down any obviously illegal content within 24 hours or face a fine of up to 50 million euros. This has led to a big increase in the number of moderators on platforms like Facebook, where apparently 1 in 6 of all Facebook moderators is now focused on Germany. But there's been a lot of criticism about whether, is the right content being removed? How do we know what content's being removed? And there's been a lot of attention on the fact that this could be, lead to over-censorship because companies want to be on the safe side, particularly when decisions have to be made within a very short time frame. It's also been sort of picked up and copied by other governments like Russia, and it's apparently being discussed in Georgia. So I wanted to start by asking Tanit about this law and whether it's really has it had any impact on freedom of speech or how people behave online.
Thank you, Emma. Well, if you followed the discussion in Germany, there was you could call a mass hysteria online regarding that, what we call Netzdg, that German law. The Ministry of Justice actually expected around 25,000 complaints per annum regarding social media, illegal content not being taken down quickly enough. The number I have for 2018 is 716 instead of 25,000. So 716 complaints were sent to the Ministry of Justice regarding Facebook and other social media companies. So just by sheer numbers, I think one might say the law has not really reached its goal. On the other hand, the enormity that was expected by some or feared by others on, as you said, sort of censorship, because the companies sort of feared court orders and massive fines, didn't really happen either. Interestingly, there was one court case involving a private person who went to the courts to basically sue Facebook for having taken down a post he made, and he won. So Facebook had to sort of reload, or at least the court stated that it was taken down when it shouldn't have been. The trouble I have with that law is that it's a bit of a trial and error thing. I do understand regulators wanting to regulate, especially after having tried to, that was the situation in Germany, they tried to get numbers from Facebook, from YouTube, from Twitter, etc. They didn't sometimes even have a person in Germany to talk to on eye-to-eye level. So what legislators then do is make laws, and that's what the companies had to realize in the end. What's very important to me, however, is that the situation we're facing currently in Germany is that you have hugely regulated areas such as television, and completely unregulated areas such as, let's say, YouTube or Facebook, and it's just a massive competitive disadvantage for independent media who want to publish things and even monetize on them, whereas, well, just one example, the Youth Protection Act means that certain horror film trailers can only be shown on homepages by media or on television between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning, whereas on YouTube you get them all day, and YouTube is monetizing on it, and nothing's being done about it. So the situation in Germany is not as catastrophic as people feared before that law was introduced. I think it's a futile law, but I also think that we do need regulation just to have a competitive eye-to-eye level between media and social media.
Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask Alexandre about the French law, which was, I think, brought into law at the end of last year, which looks specifically at misinformation online during election campaigns. And he also knows a bit about the Belgian approach to this issue.
Hi, everyone. So yes, so as you may also have heard, there is since the 22nd of December, a French law against manipulation of information, which includes many things. I think the main around this panel, we are focusing mainly on social media regulation. I think the two things to get from there is, the first one is that it's up to a judge that can be called from the Paris tribunal courthouse to judge if information has been manipulated online, and it can act very quickly because the law said in less than 48 hours a judge can decide if something is true or false during election time, so basically 3 months before an election, and have any power to remove this false information from the internet. Yes, so you can imagine how much power has a judge, first to have the capacity to decide if information is true or false. I personally think it's not up to the judge to decide this, and that 48 hours is a very large amount of time if you're looking at breaking a disinformation campaign, which can be very fast in terms of spread. And at the end, remove information from the internet. I think it's completely, let's say, mid-century vision, but 20th century vision. I think there are many flaws about this. The main thing for us is that we think the response to disinformation spreading on social media, if there should be any regulation implemented, should be in the cooperation between the platforms, the civil societies, the government, and everyone. If you look at, there is one corporation whose job for the past, I would say, 500 years has been to check information. It's called journalism. I think it's International Journalism Festival here. I think it's up to journalists to decide what's true or false. and it's very complicated to not have any cooperation with civil society. At the same time, we worked with the Belgian government in a high-level expert group at the Belgian government level to try to imagine what could be a civil society regulation of disinformation. So instead of giving this power to the judge, because we think in terms of harmful content, terrorist content, illegal content, there are already laws in place that you just need to implement them on the internet and not to have specific rules for the internet. I think that the same law should apply. If you look at the Belgian civil society coordination model that we try to find is to have a coordination between journalists, academics, government, judicial powers to work together in civil society council to be able to do research and to have access to data to understand what kind of disinformation can be observed. Right now we have a real problem in observing and trying to understand what kind of disinformation patterns we see. We can see it on Twitter because it's a very public API, but you have many disinformation campaigns we can run out through closed networks. WhatsApp is now a very practical tool for this, practical tool in India or in Brazil, we've seen the last year, or in Mexico. And you also have advertisement issues. So I think if any regulation should be implemented first, I think the regulation about having access to anonymized data to be able to research what's going on the platform, to understand what's going on with algorithms that amplify disinformation, to find back authors of disinformation, I think that's the most urgent part of disinformation that should be implemented now. And it's funny enough that we see a lot of regulation that are going on into tracking illegal content online, but not tracking illegal financial advertisement around political campaigns. I think this is one of the keys, and not only during election times. I was mentioning before, I had a crazy idea the other day, just to give you an example. I could be, let's say, an Eastern gas company. I can create a false Facebook page during German elections, saying there would be a gas shortage next winter in Germany, and that in that case we should support the construction of a pipeline of gas that could serve my interest. By doing this, I'm not doing political advertisement, but I can disrupt elections with disinformation campaigns. So I think political, not only political, but issue-based advertisement, political advertisement, and responsibility of how disinformation content is spreading online, to also define what's the responsibility of the platforms, what is the responsibility of the users, hijacking the platforms. I think it's more crucial than to have big laws on suppressing and deleting content from the internet right now.
Thank you. And Damian, it would be great if you could give an overview of what's been going on in the UK and the challenges that policymakers are facing as they move forward with these issues.
Okay, and I will, if you'll forgive me, since I'm an academic, I will answer the question that was set to me. The question I've been asked to consider is, are we moving too hastily in regulating social media? And I think it's a really good time to ask this question. We are going to see on Monday some quite radically different proposals for social media regulation in the United Kingdom. It's been clear for quite some time that a new settlement for the internet is going to be set out in Europe, not in the United States, and that will become, as it was with the GDPR, the global framework. So these decisions that we're having now around internet regulation are going to be really quite fundamental in setting out how communication works in our democracies. So hasty is a bit of a difficult word, though, because I'm going to slightly duck the question by saying we need to act quickly, but if hastily means doing the wrong stuff, we need to be very, very careful in how we take these steps. So just to simplify, and we need to simplify here, I want to just contrast what I'll call Internet Settlement 1.0, which is where we are, with Internet Settlement 2.0, which is where we're headed. So Internet Settlement 1.0, which goes back to the 1990s, we had the assumption that the internet was good for society, that it should be free, and it would benefit society in terms of its economic and social outcomes. We gave internet providers large exemptions from liability. We only loosely applied taxation law, and we had relatively ineffective competition frameworks that applied to the players within that internet ecology. Internet 2.0, which is where we're going, we have come to terms with the fact that the internet is not an unalloyed good. It has negative externalities. Maybe we should be taxing it a little bit more like alcohol and tobacco, and a little bit less like books and newspapers. And we need to change the liability arrangements to incentivize good kinds of behavior. So the UK law, which will result, we're only getting proposals next week. They will be relatively green, which means there'll be more consultation, there'll be a discussion. This whole thing is going to take several years, at the very least. But what the proposals do is move us away from the exemptions of liability, and we could go into detail about how they work, but they move towards a system whereby platforms will have more responsibility for removing content, a bit like the German law, setting out a monitoring framework. The way the framework will work, which is called a duty of care framework, which is really by giving more responsibility to the platforms themselves to regulate what's going on and to look after people within those services, a bit like stadium owners have a duty of care to people who go to see the football. And then a regulator will monitor over time whether they do so effectively, whether they are effectively meeting their duty of care. So we don't know very much about this. There'll be a list of harms. They will include disinformation. There will be other harms like child protection, etc. Things that the platform operators should be protecting us, the users, from. I think if we do this too hastily, in the sense of without enough care, we will do it wrongly, and there are a number of dangers with the move from 1.0 to 2.0. Just to list a few of them. One of them, and this is the problem, I think, with Zuckerberg's pitch for a new regulatory framework, which is quite similar to what is actually being proposed in the United Kingdom. One of them is that a new regulatory framework will raise the barriers to entry. What do I mean? I mean only Facebook or YouTube or other large players will be able to make the investments in moderation and meet the costs of the regulation more widely and take the necessary risks to provide services in certain markets. So this is a very well-established idea that by imposing a new regulatory framework, you raise the barriers to entry. That's one danger. The other one is very obvious, which is a chilling of speech. It may become too risky to provide the free public services and the public spaces that have been provided in the past. They may be removed. There may be a process whereby Facebook threatens to remove certain services in order to get a public backlash. And there may be threats of complete market exit in certain countries, particularly smaller countries, that are trying to impose new regulatory obligations and where the costs of moderation are also higher. So just to sum up and to say how I think we need to get beyond some of these problems, I don't think the problem is speed in itself. I think it is what the next settlement is and those difficult details that are yet to be hammered out. And I think, and this is the policy commission that Emma and I were involved in, set out a number of proposals on how we reach this new settlement. It's essential with a regulatory reform of this scale, which affects communication systems, that the process is transparent, that involves many parties, and that we have sufficient access to the data that's necessary in order to make those decisions. So we set out a number of proposals for a new agency which has new powers to provide the institutional support for this debate, which is going to take, as I say, several years. So speed is not necessarily the problem. We need to act quickly. There are a number of really big social problems associated with the platforms, but haste and lack of care is. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned that one of the dangers would be chilling of speech. And indeed, I think with any regulation of information online, one of the big risks is how to do this without damaging freedom of expression. And I think that one of the biggest risks of removing content is the risk that you are, taking away people's right to express themselves freely. And I wanted to ask whether you think there's more that can be done around, rather than taking down content, but around the process of how information spreads. So around advertising that's displayed alongside information, or around algorithms which just lead people down paths where they're exposed to more and more misinformation or harmful information. Where does someone like to respond?
I'd just love to challenge that freedom of speech, freedom of expression problem. I'm not I haven't finalized my thoughts on that, so I'd just love to hear from you or from you later on. So 20 years ago, that whole thing we call social media didn't exist. It's about 5 minutes old in historical terms. And at that time, because nobody knew that it would exist then, nobody would have thought about a lack of freedom of expression, because you can't post whatever you want to on Facebook, because Facebook simply wasn't there. So for me, the term censorship, and I might be a little too, I went to law school, I might be too down to law maybe regarding that, is the state telling you what to say and what not to say. Facebook is a private company, YouTube is a private company, Twitter is a private company. They could just, as private companies, set down their rules of engagement pretty easily. The reason they don't want to do is to have as much engagement as possible, which is understandable, but not necessarily an excuse. We're very Europe and US centric, by the way, in our discussion. I think last year the New York Times published an article called with the title, What if your country is a tinderbox and Facebook is the match? And this could also go for YouTube, of course, and Twitter, etc. So you have countries in the world where people are being lynched or houses are being set fire to because of what's happening on WhatsApp and social media, even things we can't see publicly. So the question I have philosophically is, are you entitled to a Facebook account? Because if you, logically, if you say freedom of expression is stalled, if somebody can't say what he wants to on Facebook, then in the end that means you are entitled to a Facebook account like you would be entitled to a passport or to, to be able to go to school in countries. So is what I never quite got, and that again is a very German law, is why the denial of Holocaust, which is a criminal offense in Germany, simply isn't sort of banned from Facebook as a general rule, because the founder doesn't want Holocaust denial on his platform. I never really got that.
I mean, it's a fascinating question, and you've put your finger on some of the really deep legal and philosophical issues around how we get out of this and what freedom of expression really means. Governments have to not only not censor speech, they also have to take measures to promote freedom of speech and ensure that, and there is something called the RUGGI principles, which are UN principles which apply to private corporations. They also have to promote freedom of speech and ensure that private companies promote freedom of speech. And what that means in this new ecology where you have market-dominant players that act as gateways to speech is quite complex, isn't it? Because you can imagine a situation in which you have lots of little Facebooks and a market of where you have a plurality of Facebooks, and the Facebook is more like a newspaper exerting some kind of editorial control. But if you have a dominant Facebook, which for many people is the internet, then you can make an argument that Facebook's moderation and Facebook's censorship, it is in effect quite similar to state control of speech. So you might be able to make freedom of speech arguments which would then oblige governments to regulate Facebook in ways which promote freedom of speech. I mean, we're lucky to have in the room one of the world experts on freedom of expression rights, Rachel Crawford-Smith, so maybe she can chip in. But I think this is going to be an area where we'll see some developments and some interesting thinking about what that positive duty on the state means as it applies to private corporations that are dominant like Facebook.
I will, in French we say rebondir, so I will take this because I think one of the most interesting thing I've read on the Gilets jaunes movement in France was a journalist going into roundabouts for interviews. And at some point he asked someone, I think it was a woman around 65 years old, and he asked to her, like, but do you read the news? She said, yes, I pay for the news every month, you know, with my broadband. He said, yeah, you pay? Yeah, I pay, and then I go to Facebook because Facebook is news. So I don't understand why I pay journalists on Facebook and they don't give me right information. So I think there is a huge confusion in all a part of the population of what Facebook is. And I think if you look back at what Facebook claims they are and what they really are, so are they a platform to connect people, or are they a publishing platform for media to advertise and to be an advertising place? And I think there is a huge shift about the initial promise of Facebook and what it really is. So if we're going to this, if we admit that Facebook is no more a platform where when people connect together, but a platform made for publishers to advertise their publications, it's a whole different story, because then we have to understand how the publication works. What is the workflow behind this? What is the algorithm? So it means that yesterday I was in a panel with Facebook on fact-checking, and said, like, but how do you detect disinformation on the platform? He said, and he said, at some point, he said, like, well, for instance, we know that if we have that kind of thing, it's suspicious for us. So in my head, I said, so you have criterions. So why don't you explain them? Why don't you share them with academics, with other people? And I think it should be the same with how they distribute news. And I think there are a few projects that are trying to understand right now, like Facebook Tracking Exposed, how distribution of news and content is being made there. Because then you look at the organic amplification, so how the algorithm is pushing things. Then you can look at advertisement, I talked about it. And then we need to look at cross-platform. So basically, when I enjoy some kind of algorithm amplification on Facebook, does it have an effect on YouTube? Does it have an effect on Instagram? Does it have an effect on Google search? So we don't know exactly on this whole new ecosystem how things are talking to each other. And because we don't know, I think to go back to the question, is it being done too hastily? I don't know if too hastily is the term, but we don't know how it works. It's a black box of black boxes. And we're trying just to catch the rabbit which get out of here, and maybe it's not a rabbit, maybe it's a dog, you know? And we might design laws for catching rabbits, and then we just need to catch dogs. We don't know. So I think there is a huge thing. And when you talk about algorithm transparency, you have this whole discussion about, yeah, but you know, it's a company, they have like a commercial secret about what it's done. So, yeah, okay. My question is, it's a broader question. So how come that after every scandal after scandal, number of users are not decreasing on Facebook? Because people are, maybe it's only my filter bubble, but I met a lot of people that are angry about this, but they don't leave Facebook. And my opinion is because there is no alternative. Because everyone is there. So you might be upset about everything, but you can't go anywhere else, because even if you have data portability, you cannot find another place where you can do these kind of things. So there is actually no competition. So if we're looking at the US side, which we should sometimes look a bit in Europe, there is a huge antitrust issue around here, because Facebook is in dominant position with no competitors in that field of news distribution for people. And I think maybe we should look at this, and maybe by looking at this, we can find a way of having a way of tackling this issue from both sides of the Atlantic, because it's also a US company. So at some point, they're more interested in Washington than everything else.
I'd like to jump in, because there's one thing you said about that, that Gilets jaunes woman in France, which I find sort of hits the point. The Reuters Institute, I think 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, you probably know better, had a study on how people consume news on Facebook and how much they remember. And they do indeed remember a lot of the news they were in touch with on Facebook. They sadly do not remember the source. They take Facebook as the source. So they won't say, I read this on, I don't know, Le Monde or hastily or Spiegel on Facebook. They say, I read it on Facebook. And if there's one thing I would love Facebook to look into, is how to allow for media companies, independent media companies, to build their brands, because if you look at all the trust indices, independent media brands are still very much trusted. Just social media isn't very much trusted, because people mix up social media as sort of proper media. But because it all looks the same, and because most people, and why should they, don't go into sort of deep dive into which is a URL. It looks like a news site, so it could be from Macedonia, it could be independent. It all sort of looks pretty much the same. It's the same look and feel. There's no, if you go to a newsstand at Perugia train station, you will be able, especially as an Italian or in your home countries, you'll definitely be able to tell which paper is which simply by the front page. Not even like in 30 meters, 50 meters away, you can tell that's this paper, and on Facebook it all looks the same. So it's very, very hard for independent media, which I think do the fact-checking stuff pretty accurately, to sort of help society distinguish between truth and wrong. I had a private dinner. I was at a private dinner on Monday where Mark Zuckerberg was the guest of honor in Berlin, and there was Chatham House rules, so I can't say what he said. Just give you my impression of which was the impression I had before, and sadly he didn't do much to alter it. So Facebook regularly says we do care about news. We very much care about news. Sheryl Sandberg has said it, etc. The fact is that it used to be 5% news content on your news feed. 95% is pictures of people making holidays, food, dogs, etc. So news for Facebook is actually a very minor topic. It's a major topic in terms of image, so it's pretty much a pain in the ass, probably, for them. They say, we care about news, we care about investigative journalism. What they don't, I think, and still don't think after Monday, very much care about is the business model of journalism, because they don't help it be sustainable on Facebook. And if they cared more, I think they could do a lot more by sharing data, by helping to promote brand building. Instagram, belonging to Facebook, is now pretty much moving to be a shopping site. So why will it be easy, or is already easy, to buy shoes on Instagram and not to get a subscription for the New York Times? And these are all things, if we, I think, as a society, pushed Facebook more into the direction of, and not just sort of government regulators to regulate, but Facebook to be more open for competition and freedom of market, I think this could actually maybe even help more than hastily, to sort of come to the question, hastily done legislation.
Thank you. And yes, I think that what this discussion has shown is that there's a lot of questions remain about the role that a network like Facebook plays in our lives, practically on a societal level, and from a legal point of view. And is it, as you said, do we have a right to a Facebook account? Is it at that level? And I think that, yes, was saying that people just say, you know, I found out something on Facebook. I think it's even going one step further than that, that people, and I've talked to people who've done research where people just say, you know, oh, how did you find this out? And it's just like, oh, well, it was on my phone. And I think that that's kind of the next level, because people, you know, you have your phone, something flashes up, you know, you read it, and people don't always know what they're getting information from. I don't know if anybody else wants to respond, or whether we could, take some questions from the audience now. Yeah.
Thanks, and thanks for the very interesting discussion, really important issue. Helen Derbyshire from Access Info Europe. I have two questions, one for Alexandre, is it? I didn't quite get your comment about 500 years of journalism, because yes, journalists know how to do fact-checking, but there's a lot of non-journalists producing and putting out media that's never getting filtered by journalists, as you yourself said with the Facebook story. So I didn't quite get your point there, but I think it's an interesting one, the role of journalists in all of this. And for Damian primarily, although for anybody else, Tanit as well. I liked your duty of care of the people going to the football stadium, and I was kind of reflecting on that. Of course, a football stadium doesn't just run without any rules. There's a whole host of regulations that any big enterprise, public space, whatever, has to comply with. There will be fire. They don't just have to have a duty of care and that's enough for fire regulations or toilets or whatever it might be. I mean, there's hundreds of regulations that they're going to have to comply with. And maybe that is the analogy. We need to look at not just one solution to this, but a whole series of regulations. And what we see, I work on access to information, and what we see increasingly is requirements on businesses in many different sectors, environment, extractive industries. Now companies are having to report on different aspects of gender treatment, pay gap, etc. I mean, any field of transparency of company registers. So any field you look at, there are obligations to comply with certain laws and to be transparent. And isn't perhaps that's what we need to construct for social media as well? Thanks.
Yeah, on your question. So, yeah, my comment on this is to say that I think journalism is the only profession with a deontology on checking information, and that it's not only them that can push information and verify things and get things out of the blue, but I think at some point, when you reach to a journalist, I think you are quite sure that some kind of deontology is applied to the content that you give to them. And I think we should be able to rely on this deontology and on this kind of practice, which are, I think, good for civil society in its whole. So my comment was about more to say, like, I think it's more up to a journalist to look at what's the story and what's being true or false, of what's being investigated, better than to a judge who can judge what's illegal regarding to the law. But when we are talking about disinformation, in my case, disinformation is not illegal content very much. It's very, very gray zone, and I think only journalism can help on this.
Sorry, how would it work if you've got to take a decision whether to take it down or not?
But the thing is, we cannot take it down. I think if you have, so there is a law on false information in France before that one, so it's illegal to spread false information, but I don't think it's up to a judge to delete it. I think it's up to journalists to do their work, to flag it, and then by flagging this, the journalist can flag and then give this to a judge who at the end can make the case because he has been working in close cooperation with journalism. But you have a process on this. It's just a judge in an office who just like being called by politicians because they're not happy about fake news and decides on his own what's going on and if it's true or false. Right now, no civil society, no journalist is implied in checking what's true or false in that law in France. Not at all. It's only a judge in an office who decides, and I think that's not good.
I mean, I basically agree, the stadium analogy is not me, it's Lorna Woods who put together this duty of care proposal. But I just want to push back and I think just challenge what I think is a kind of mistaken but long-term view of the news industry and journalism about regulation. You know, we're in the situation, and we've had a very oppositional approach coming from journalism to social media platforms. And I think the comment you made, which I think really does need unpacking, was that broadcasting is at a competitive disadvantage because it has so much regulation, and social media has so much regulation. And this kind of zero-sum thinking is really, you know, it's not where we should be. We should be thinking about what kind of communicative systems we need in a democracy, and how to, you know, get the deontology of truth-seeking into those decentralized systems. We shouldn't be thinking in these zero-sum ways. Broadcasting isn't like social media. They're different. We should stop trying to force these services into different kind of categories. They're different from the point of view of free speech. They're different from the point of view of the kind of regulatory benefits that they get in terms of spectrum, prominence, all sorts of things. The overarching assumption coming from journalism and news is that regulation is always bad. In fact, regulation for broadcasters gives more benefits. It gives you the prominence. It gives you the access to funding. It gives you all sorts of benefits. So regulation is...
Sorry, let me just ask, because
Sure.
This could be a German-British misunderstanding here. What benefits for funding do German broadcasters? There's no funding. Just to give you an example of, I don't want to go into too much detail.
You have publicly funded broadcasters for some of them, and you have...
I'm talking about a private company here.
Yeah, and not everybody can set up a broadcasting company. They have a license, which is a license to print money.
To make my point a little clear, the regulations on broadcasting go for broadcasters, also sort of broadcasters digitally have to comply with the same regulations on their online sites as they have on television, whereas YouTube doesn't. So online, if our site, I'm not sure who's seen that horror movie Us, or the trailer to see Us, a German news site which is run by a so-called broadcaster, we have to sort of, I think, step up. Again, not thinking broadcasting, it's a media company, but regulated. Cannot show that trailer, cannot monetize on that, that's advertising, whereas YouTube can and does. And that, of course, is a competitive disadvantage. I'm not saying I dislike regulation. I'm pretty happy there's fire regulation, I assume, in this building. And I know it's not all just, and you heard my comment about Holocaust denial, etc. But it's just, at the moment, it's not a level playing field. It's unfair. And it's getting even worse if, as you said, if publicly funded companies from the Kremlin, like Russia Today, gets a better chance to pop up when I search for certain things on YouTube than an independent media company which has no public funding at all, not like the BBC, not like German public television, which has to make its way there. And I'm not expecting Google or Facebook to sort of invent a business model for us. I'm just asking both the regulators and the tech companies not to sort of make our life even more difficult than it is.
Can we take a couple more questions? I know, okay, there was...
1, 2. Hello. My name is Sebastian from Germany. Just a question because on the German hate speech law and the political impact it has. Because there are 3 parties sitting in the German Bundestag right now who are heavily opposed against that law, and media on the left and right, they promote like VK and Telegram and all other networks. So not that whatever we're trying to do leads to a shift nobody expected and complaints later. So just for me, for the academic.
Can we take then another question just behind as well, just so that we can get through them a bit quicker?
Thanks. The woman before mentioned extractive industries. So why are we looking at these companies and taking it for granted that they are platforms for free speech? I think you could make the case that they are extractive industries. They're extracting our data and turning it into profit models? And why are we looking at the ultimate good of being able to be perfectly targeted with the advertisement so you don't have to see anything you don't want to buy? I mean, this is the basic for these platforms. So I really do think that as we're looking at the regulatory approach, we need to be much, much more sophisticated in terms of how we're looking at these platforms. And with respect to, you know, free speech and, sorry, my name is Courtney Radge, I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists. You know, there is also speech on the platforms that prevent expression. So yesterday we did a session on state trolling of journalists. So we also know that you know, types of speech can be weaponized and targeted at journalists and others. So can we think in a more sophisticated way than just, oh, this person can express themselves? Can we think about when does expression become behavior and therefore less problematic to regulate? And yeah, so just would like your thoughts on those ideas.
Right, should we answer those two questions quickly and then?
Happy to have a go. I'm not sure I quite got the essence of your question about the politics of these regulatory discussions, but I think there is a real issue, and I think we need to look very hard and carefully at how these questions about regulation are dealt with on the political level. If you think about the history of how this worked with the press, and some of the imperfections in relationships between newspapers and political interests in society, where you have the ability to control an information gateway in society and affect democratic outcomes and democratic debates, that causes a huge conflict of interest. And you have exactly the same conflict of interest with discussions about the regulatory framework for the platforms. This enables Mark Zuckerberg to do deals with various political forces, in theory and potentially in practice. If Elizabeth Warren stands on a ticket of breaking up Facebook, what is going to happen to her Facebook campaign? Question. That's the one we need. That's the one we need to be thinking about. On extractive data, I'm totally with you. If anyone in the room hasn't yet read Zuboff's book on behavioral surplus and its implications for a new model of capitalism, you all should read it. At least the first 3 chapters, because it's a really massive book. But we've had a huge societal debate about these platforms, how they work, the implications they have for speech and behavior. We need to bring that discussion in an orderly way to a negotiation with the platforms about, we can affect what the platforms are. That we're having a discussion with Zuckerberg and the others about their autonomy from the state in numerous places around the world and what their responsibilities are. It's very broad. It's going to take a very long time, and we have to decide what they are trusted to resolve themselves and the framework that parliaments have to put in place to ensure that they have the right incentives to do that.
I would say also there is a question of civic rules to be applied on the internet. And I think we should stress to avoid double standards. I'm going to take a very short example of what happened in France the past month. There was a huge crisis in France last summer called the Benalla case. I think you all know about it, the bodyguard of Macron that was caught in video beating up demonstrators. It's now reported that people working in Macron's team used an anonymous Twitter account to spread a false video to exonerate Mr. Benalla of his actions. And when Ismaël Emelien, so former advisor of Macron, was asked about it on French TV this week, he said, but you know, on Twitter it's the rule. That's how it goes. So I think we should remind everyone there is no double standard. There is no bad behavior from one side on fake news, etc. And yeah, it's okay because, you know, it's politics. No. So I think we all need also to work together to also redefine what are the rules online, and they are no different of the rules offline. And I think we should all remind us this and to people that are working in that field.
It was what, Rachel, did you have a question? So you put up.
It was really just to sort of follow up on that. I mean, if the rules are to be the same on the online as they are offline, and we want to make a distinction between illegal content and content which perhaps we don't like very much, which we're going to tolerate. Offline, we have used, and you seem very questionable about the courts and the role of the courts, but their role has been to establish what's true, what's false, and to apply things like standards of proof. So in your French fake law legislation, you have to have manifest proof. It has to be at a very high standard of proof, and it has to be put forward by the person who's making the case. They have to substantiate it, and you have to prove that it's going to affect electors at the final decision when they come to vote. So it's probably not going to be effective at all. So I agree with you that probably this law is, 20th century, it's not effective. But it's not to say that judges and courts in certain contexts can play an independent role. And I think Damian's also raised the question about, do we also want to put our trust in the big companies themselves with their economic and other interests? So don't throw out the role of the courts altogether. And I think just as an offline, they can play within a certain niche an important role online as well.
Yeah, I'm just throwing it out as the first thing to do. I think there are many, many other things to do before that, but I'm not ruling this out.
Thanks. I don't know if we have time for any more questions. Tanit, did you want to respond more about the hate speech law?
If I don't, we maybe can get another question in.
Okay. Can we do one more question?
You mentioned a couple of times the word competition, and then you mentioned Elizabeth Warren called to break up Facebook, and then our friend here mentioned data. I think perhaps we're looking at the wrong problem, content. Instead, we should be looking at dimensions, scale, and competition, and perhaps define the industry, not as a media industry, but as a data industry, and then define that as the relevant market, and perhaps have something to say about that, and break up the data sharing, not from a privacy point of view, but from a competition point of view.
Would anyone like to give any final thoughts?
I'm very sympathetic with this view. I think the point I'm making, and it's clear that competition law, as it stands, has not worked. It's been far too focused on price, which doesn't work with free services, and existing methodologies have not really prevented the emergence of these enormously powerful players that combine data and other services and markets. In a way, as we think about the regulatory framework, we haven't worked out what the end game is. And that's why I think Zuckerberg's discussion of data portability is a really interesting one. I think one of the panelists said earlier that one of the issues is that it's very, very difficult to switch between platforms because there's no competition. So is the end game we're going for a situation in which you have multiple Facebooks and the ability to take port your data out of those services and then move into other services? And that creates a competitive constraint on those companies and a need for them to actually respond to some of these concerns. So competition is doing the work of regulation, if you like. Or is the end game, and I think this is what Zuckerberg wants, a regulated monopoly? So a company which combines all of these different services has successfully raised the barriers to entry and is regulated in that position. I'd prefer the former, but I can't, to be perfectly honest, see how we're going to get there. I think we need to be very smart, and I think we need to dig in for a 5 to 10 year regulatory negotiation. And the challenge is to get civil society, academia, good data, and to really tool up for what is going to be a very big and very important debate.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to end there, but if anyone has any more questions, do come and ask us now, outside. Thank you.